we've been talking to different musicians about sense of place, the place that they come from. And you and I probably had fast food and watch MTV or whatever. We've seen a lot of the same thing in mass culture, but is there something in your music that comes out of the place that you consider your roots or your home?
I think that most of the stuff that I play comes from where I come from, I think a musician's life is kind of like a regular life of a human being, where your first 7 years, they determine who you are. In other words, if you come from Brooklyn and you live there from age 1 to 7, you can go anywhere in the world, you're still from Brooklyn, and that's going to really define who you are. And it's the same with music, although I don't think it's from 1 to 7. I think as a musician, what you're exposed to up to about the age of 17, 18 years old, that really determines who you are. And then everything else, you just kind of pile on top of that. So for me, coming from New York, coming from the big city where all these influences were happening at the same time, and there's a lot of funk, there's a lot of jazz, and hip-hop was just starting when I was coming up, I think that really kind of determines who I am and my sound.
Well, you've also talked about, the kind of stuff you learned in the street versus you went to Queens College in music, right? So, and you've talked about the difference in that. Could you comment on that, like the difference between sort of street learning and school learning, or?
Well, yeah, I came up kind of on 2 tracks as a musician. I had a formal training. I played clarinet all the way. I went to Music and Art High School, the LaGuardia School for high school, and I went to Queens College, all on clarinet. And then I played bass pretty much in the street, meaning I played in dance bands. I jammed with guys, and I just kind of learned as I went. And it's two different ways of learning music. I think if you only learn in school, there's probably something that you're missing. And if you only learn in the street, there's something you're missing. From school, I kind of got to understand what it is I was doing. I know what the nouns and the verbs are of music, On the street, sometimes you just learn. It's kind of like learning how to speak without taking English courses. You just kind of absorb it. And so, playing in clubs and stuff and learning that way, you learn how to get people's attention really quickly, because your whole show will depend on whether you can keep people's attention. Whereas in school, the audiences are usually more controlled that you play for, so they have to pay attention, So you don't really develop that skill of really just kind of, really grabbing people, So I think both are really important. If you can get both, I think that's the ultimate.
And do you I assume that you think those kind of performing arts schools are a good thing for young musician types? I mean, it seems like there's one in New Orleans that's been an incredible seed for new talent and stuff.
I think performing arts schools are essential, to keep this music going, because there's not as much jazz going around in the real world these days. When I was coming up, there was a club, and I'm talking about like the 80s, there was a club every 2 blocks in the Village in New York, and uptown, there were places you could play and learn. And nowadays, I don't think that's the scene. And the schools, the kind of music performing arts schools, are really where you get to learn. So, I think without them, we'd really be in trouble. I'm just hoping that the scene will eventually revitalize itself and provide more street situations for musicians to learn in.
That's great. The other thing we were asking people about, and thinking about place, is the sort of difference between a musician who, in studio, album type, film scoring work, is a very kind of private thing, where you're working with collaborators, versus walking out on the stage and how, the musicians have to go between that public-private thing. How do you deal with that? I mean, I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah, it's definitely 2 different ways of making music. You're in the studio with just the musicians, and like you said, it's a very private way of making music, where you have to imagine your audience. You have to imagine who you're connecting to, or sometimes you don't imagine. Sometimes you just play for each other, But as soon as you get an audience in front of you, there becomes that dialogue, and it completely changes the music. You can't help it. I mean, you can't help but try to relate to the people standing in front of you. You know what I mean? So it's really 2 different ways of making music, which is really cool to me, because when you're making music for each other, or you're making music just based on what's in your mind, that's a real true reflection of what's going on internally, your private self. And then when you play for audience, that's kind of your public self. And I think it's nice, if you're a good enough artist, I think it's a nice thing to be able to present both sides of yourself like that.
Tell me about the film work stuff you do. I mean, do you enjoy that? I mean, do you try to play off the picture, or how do you conceptualize, film score work?
When I write for films, it's really, you basically give yourself to the film. You're basically there to try to help guide people emotionally through the story. And that's really all you do. So what you really have to do is understand what the director is really trying to do. You really want to find out what the director wants the audience to feel. In other words, you watch movies, we've all experienced it, where we're really feeling for a guy who we have no business feeling for. He could be a murderer, he could be like a really messed up dude, but because of the way he's presented in this film, we're feeling for him. And that's partially due to the way the composer writes the music. If we tell you to like a guy musically, you subconsciously won't know why, but you're going, hey, he killed 14 people, but he's pretty cool. He has, there's another side to him. So it's good for me, man, because it's not under my control. It forces me to find colors and find moods that I normally might not go for. And then when I go to make my own music, I have so many more tools available to myself because I've already kind of experimented with them in doing this movie.
I heard this guy last night. He's an Art Gormley. He's a sculptor in England, and he said the seeds of every project, as he's working on a project, he's living in the moment, but the seed for the next project is always kind of born in that project he's working on now. Do you kind of feel that you've kind of progressed through a series of
For me, my inspiration for music, my biggest problem when I'm doing an album is eliminating the ideas. You know what I mean? I've got a million of them, and it's really just going what makes the most logical sense based on what I just did and what I've done recently and where I want to go. What's the next logical step? It's not really difficult finding the ideas. It's just, for me, it's paring down and going, no, it's not time for this idea, it's not time for that idea. So I think it's true that when you're working on a project, you go, okay, I can see the next logical step, because this is becoming real, this project here, and now it's starting to tell me what I need to do next. It's the same when you solo. When you're soloing, the hardest part about playing a solo is the first line. That's the one you got to pull out of the air, The next line is just the most logical answer to the thing you just played. So you really end up just answering yourself. So if you can get started, then you'll be all right.
Oh, that's interesting. I've noticed your website is really, really active, and you seem to be responding to people on your website. Do you like that kind of interaction on the web with your audience? I mean,
I love interacting with my audience on the web, on the internet. Like 20 years ago, man, you put out an album, and if you're a human being and you put out an album, that means you want to connect to an audience. You want to get the response back. That's the whole point. And 20 years ago, only thing we had to go by was what some jaded critic would write about you'd have to open up some magazine. And the critics, they're really trying to tell you more about themselves than they are trying to tell you about your music, which is natural. So now with the advent of the internet, man, you can go on and you can get a ton of reactions, more than you can handle, about your music, and they're always honest, you know what I mean? It's not like anyone's trying to prove anything usually. They're just telling you their honest reactions, man, and that's beautiful because now I feel closer to the people I'm making music for, and I've eliminated the middleman,
I mean, I was just seeing, like last week, guys writing saying, I'll see you in Newport, I hope, and you write right back. That's really cool to be able to communicate that way.
Yeah, and it makes everybody real, it makes you real to the audience, it makes the audience real to me because, sometimes it's just a bunch of faces, and you really don't get a sense. But, it's, I think it's one of the most positive things of the internet is just connecting people and making everybody real.
Yeah. I read one place too that you had this experience where somebody came up to you and they had a 3-year-old kid and they said, "This is my son Marcus." Could you talk a little bit about just you're kind of getting into more of your mature phase as an artist and what that means to the music and to you personally?
Well, I think you go through phases as a musician. When you first start playing music, you play for any number of reasons because it's interesting and because, you start playing and you realize you're getting attention, and it's nice, And you stay in that phase for a while and then maybe, you make some money and then all of a sudden you want to play and make more money. But I'll tell you, for me, a couple of things happened to me. One is when I was in South Africa about 7 or 8 years ago, and one of the journalists in South Africa in Cape Town said to me, "Man, do you know how important the song you wrote for Miles Tutu, do you know how important that was to us when we were struggling for our freedom here in South Africa. And I said, well, no, I really didn't even realize that you would get to hear that song, Tutu. And they said, no, we heard it, and it gave us a lot of strength, and I want to thank you for it, you know. So that was one moment for me. And then, like you were saying, man, people come up to me all the time and say, hey, this is my kid, his name is Marcus, you know. We named him after you because your music has helped us so much in our life. Those kind of things, man, make you realize how powerful music is and how much effect you can have on people you don't even know. And it's really a humbling experience because, you know, the next time you go in the studio, you realize I'm making music that might help somebody I don't even know, man. It might help somebody. It might cause somebody to be born. It might cause somebody to come out of a bad situation. There's no telling what this music can do. And when you know that you have that kind of effect on people, it makes you take your music a little bit more seriously.
I noticed on your website too, you touch a little bit about being a spiritual person. I mean, I don't know if you want to talk about your spiritual feelings or whatever. I mean, you seem pretty grounded and.
You know, the most important thing about being a musician and trying to stay in touch with your spirit is to recognize that the music doesn't come from you. If you think that the music is being generated from inside you, then it's very easy for you to run out of stuff. You know, and it's very easy for you to get buried under the weight of making music. But if you only recognize that it's just coming through you, that, you know, that God has created this incredible life and all you have to do is live it and then interpret it through your music. So the music's really just coming through you. As long as you recognize that, man, it takes all the weight off, it takes all the pressure off, man. And you realize that your most valuable gift is simply your filter, you know, the way you see things and the way you present it back to people. So it's not that heavy, you know what I mean? It's not that difficult. All you gotta do is be yourself and interpret life. And hopefully, you know, when you present it to people, it'll resonate for them.
Amazing, that's pretty amazing. Anything particular you like about the festival scene versus playing concert halls? Or, I mean, you do a lot of festival work, I mean, obviously in Europe and that kind of thing.
You know, there are different environments of festival scene versus, you know, when you're doing like your own concert, you know. Obviously, when you're doing your own concert, all the energy's focused on you and everyone there knows who you are because that's why they're there and they know they're familiar with your music. But with a festival thing, it's more of it reminds me of more of like the New York scene when I was coming up, where you don't know if these people know you or not. They might have came for the guy who played before you or the guy who played after you, and it's your chance to present your music to people who might not be familiar with you, but people who are music lovers, you know. So it's really a great situation, you know. And you know, for the musicians, I mean, it's almost like going to a convention because the only time we get to see each other anymore are in places like this. I just saw Josh Redman. I haven't seen him in a year and a half, you know. But you know, these are the kind of situations where you run into the other cats, you know, and it reminds you that this is really what music is all about: is musicians and relationships between musicians. So I really value playing the festivals for that in particular.
So you must be a very busy guy, though. I mean, do you feel kind of just driven sometimes, or overwhelmed, or how do you cope with that?
Well, you know, being from New York, my pace has always been like mad, you know. I mean, even as a kid, man, I was always trying to get 3 or 4 things done in a day on the subways, and you know, so it's a really natural pace for me, that kind of helter-skelter thing. And for me, I don't think I would do well if I only got to concentrate on one thing. If they said, look, this is your project for the next 3 months, you don't do anything else, I'd have too much energy for one project, you know. So for me, doing a few things at the same time kind of mellows me out and gives me a better kind of peaceful way to make the music.
I think that's pretty much it. Let's see. Some of your most fruitful or intense, you know, kind of synergy collaborations with Luther Vandross and Miles and that kind of thing. Does one of those stand out with you, that it's something that's really kind of stuck with you longer than others? That might be a tough question. I don't know.
No, man, I've had some amazing kind of musical relationships, man. I've been very blessed that way, man. Roberta Flack, Luther Vandross, Miles Davis, David Sanborn, Shaka Khan, Aretha Franklin. You know what I mean? I don't think any one is any more important than the other. They're all really tremendously important for me. I mean, it really shaped who I am. I mean, I think as a musician, Miles was probably the most profound, just because when I got to him, his history had already spanned 40 years, you know, and there was so much under each word that he said, you know, and everything he said was so deep, and the things that he said I'm still figuring out now, and he's been gone for like 16 years. I'm still going, oh man, that's what he meant, you know? And sometimes because I respected him so much, the stuff that he said wasn't deep, and I gave it deepness, but even that's inspiring, you know what I mean? It just makes me go somewhere else. So I would probably have to look at Miles as being a tremendous influence, but Luther Vandross, he was the first guy I saw from the beginning of his career to complete stardom, you know, and I saw what it took. I'd never seen a belief in oneself as strong as Luther had, you know. When he first started sending out his little demos, everyone told him, man, look, all you do is sing. You know, there's really no place for just a stand-up singer. This was in the days of Earth, Wind & Fire and Cameo and all these bands who had like 14 guys with suits on and laser beams and smoke bombs going off, you know. And all this cat did was sing. And they told him, well, I don't know. And he stuck to his guns. He didn't change his music. And somebody finally relented and gave him a little record deal, and the record just caught on fire. You know, people had been thirsting for this kind of music, and he had it. And I saw him make decisions like that throughout his life, man, and saw it pay off for him, man. So it's incredible lessons I learned from him.
We're trying to ask people too, I mean, to thank JVC for, you know, they've been a big sponsor of this festival, and they've sponsored jazz festivals all over. And there's a way in which they really kind of contributed to the keeping the thing alive. So I don't know if you feel comfortable with that, but we're just
sort of say thank you for, they've been sponsoring this since 1984.
Since '84?
Yeah.
that's a lot of.
And they come back and they just want to do a nice piece of people acknowledging that their support for
JVC from Japan?
Yeah.
Okay, that's no problem for me. I'm a JVC artist. They put my records out in Japan, so this will be good for me. So, do you want me to do it like a promo, or do you want me to be answering a question for
Yeah,
you?
answer the question would be better, to be honest
Okay.
with you. So how do you feel about JVC and their, you know, do you think they've been somebody that's been a supporter? And
I think the thing about JVC is that they're an incredible supporter of jazz. I mean, they distribute my records in Japan, and, you know, the jazz market all over the world is starting to get a little small, and JVC hasn't flinched. I mean, they're really still standing behind this music, and, you know, when it turns around, which I'm sure it will, I think one of the reasons is going to be because of the commitment JVC has to putting this music out and presenting this music to people. So, man, I'm happy they're around, man. I'm happy that they're, hey, man, what's going on? I'm just happy JVC's here, man, doing their thing, and, you know, keeping this tradition going, man. You know, this Newport Festival is an old festival. I remember Miles telling me about this festival from back in the 50s. So to keep it going, man, is a huge commitment. So I'm really happy they're around.
thank you so much. That's great. That's really good.
There's a lot of funk, there's a lot of jazz, and hip-hop was just starting when I was coming up. I think that really kind of determines who I am and my sound.
Well, you've also talked about, you know, the kind of stuff you learned in the street versus you went to Queens College in music, right? So, and you've talked about the difference in that. Could you comment on that, like the difference between sort of street learning and school learning, or?
Well, yeah, I came up kind of on two tracks as a musician. I had a formal training. I played clarinet all the way. I went to Music and Art High School, the LaGuardia School for high school, and I went to Queens College.
We've been talking to different musicians about sense of place, you know, the place that they come from. And, you know, you and I probably had fast food and watch MTV or whatever. We've seen a lot of the same thing in mass culture. But is there something in your music that comes out of the place that you consider your roots or your home?
I think that most of the stuff that I play comes from where I come from, you know. I think a musician's life is kind of like a regular life of a human being, where your first 7 all on clarinet, and then I played bass pretty much in the street, you know, meaning I played in dance bands, I jammed with guys, and I just kind of learned as I went. And there's two different ways of learning music, you know. I think if you only learn in school, you know, there's probably something that you're missing, and if you only learn in the street, there's something you're missing. You know, from school, I kind of got to understand what it is I was doing. I know what the nouns and the verbs are of music, you know. On the streets, years, they determine who you are. In other words, if you come from Brooklyn and you live there from age 1 to 7, you can go anywhere in the world, you're still from Brooklyn, and that's gonna really define who you are. And it's the same with music, although I don't think it's from 1 to 7. I think as a musician, you know, what you're exposed to up to about the age of 17, 18 years old, that really determines who you are. And then everything else you just kind of pile on top of that. So for me, coming from New York, coming from the big city where all these influences were happening at the same time, and sometimes you just learn, it's kind of like learning how to speak without taking English courses. You just kind of absorb it. And so, you know, playing in clubs and stuff and learning that way, you learn how to get people's attention really quickly, you know what I mean? Because your whole show will depend on whether you can keep people's attention. Whereas in school, the audiences are usually more controlled that you play for, so they have to pay attention, you know? So you don't really develop that skill of really just kind of, you know, really grabbing people, you know? So I think both are really important. If you can get both, I think